The steel door slammed behind Daniel Reid with a finality that echoed through the cell block like a judge's gavel. 14 days. That's how long he'd been inside Riverside State Correctional Facility, and he was still learning the rhythms of this concrete world. The morning count, the shuffle to chow, the careful avoidance of eye contact that could mean anything from respect to challenge. He'd kept his head down, observed everything, said little. The real estate training had taught him that. Watch the property, understand its flaws, identify the angles before making your pitch. Prison wasn't so different, just another market with different currency. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as he walked toward his assigned work detail in the laundry facility, Daniel realized his period of observation was about to end. Reid. Daniel Reid. The voice came from behind him, deep and measured. Daniel stopped, turned slowly. 3 men blocked the corridor. The one who'd spoken stood in the center, a broad-shouldered black man in his mid-40s, with gray threading through his close-cropped hair. His prison blues were pressed sharp, and he wore them like a tailored suit. The 2 flanking him were younger, harder, their eyes scanning the hallway with practiced vigilance. "That's me," Daniel said, keeping his tone neutral. The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "DeMarco Jackson. People call me Marco. I run things on C Block." He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. Firm grip, measuring. This was a test, he knew. Everything here was a test. "Walk with me," Marco said, and it wasn't a request. On the contrary, it was an obligation imposed with a threatening coldness. They moved down the corridor, the 2 enforcers trailing a few steps behind. Marco walked like he owned the place, nodding to passing inmates who quickly stepped aside. The guards at the checkpoint barely glanced up. "You settling in okay?" Marco asked conversationally. 14 days now, right? That's enough time to understand how things work here." "I'm learning," Daniel replied. "Good, good. Learning's important." Marco guided them into an empty common area, gesturing to a metal table. They sat. The enforcers positioned themselves at the entrance. "So, here's what I've learned about you, Daniel. You're educated. Clean record before this. And you come from money. Real money." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest, but kept his face perfectly still. "My father had money." "Had?" Marco leaned back, studying him. "Right, right. That's why you're here. Poisoned the old man, they say. Inheritance dispute?" Daniel felt the tremor of a sudden anger rising within him. He had to suppress this outburst and keep the calm expression on his face. And for that moment, he succeeded. "I didn't do it." "Sure, sure. Nobody in here did what they're accused of." Marco's smile widened. "But here's the thing. It doesn't matter. What matters is your father owned Reid properties. Commercial real estate all over the eastern seaboard. I read about the trial. Estate worth what? 30 million? 40? Daniel said nothing. The analytical part of his mind was already working, cataloging Marco's tells, the power structure being displayed, the direction this conversation was heading. "See, in here, we all got to contribute to the community," Marco continued. "It's how we maintain peace, keep the animals from tearing each other apart. I provide protection, order, access to certain necessities. In return, people contribute based on their means." He leaned forward. "A man like you, Daniel, with family money sitting on the outside, your contribution's going to be significant." There it was. The pitch. Daniel had heard variations of it 1,000 times in conference rooms. "Pay us, or things get difficult." "How significant?" Daniel asked quietly. Marco seemed pleased he wasn't getting resistance. "5,000 a month, deposited to an account I'll provide. Your people on the outside make the transfer. You stay protected in here. Simple business. Daniel let the silence stretch, watching Marco's confidence solidify. The man thought he'd already won. "And if I don't pay?" Daniel asked. The smile vanished. "Then you don't have protection. And a pretty boy like you, with soft hands and money he won't share?" Marco shrugged. "Accidents happen. People get hurt. Some of my boys, they got long sentences. Nothing to lose. They might decide you're disrespectful. Might decide to teach you some manners in a way that leaves permanent damage." He paused. "Or maybe we just make your commissary disappear. Your mail gets lost. Guards suddenly don't see when someone's messing with your cell. Little things that make 14 days feel like 14 years." Daniel absorbed this, his mind working through variables like he used to calculate property values. Marco controlled the inmate economy. The guards were complicit or paid off. Standard prison extortion, sophisticated enough to avoid official attention. Anyone who resisted became an example. Most people would pay. It was easier, safer. But Daniel Reid wasn't most people. "I need to think about it," Daniel said. Marco's eyes hardened. "You got 24 hours. After that, the price doubles. And if you're thinking about running to the guards or the warden," he laughed. "Go ahead, see how far that gets you. This place works because everyone understands the system. Don't be stupid, Daniel." 24 hours, Daniel repeated, standing up. Marco watched him leave, and Daniel could feel those calculating eyes on his back. The enforcers parted to let him through. As Daniel walked back toward his cell, his mind was already racing. This wasn't just an injustice, it was an equation. And every equation had a solution. There had to be an equation, a way to overcome this injustice. The rest of the day, Daniel observed, really observed. At lunch, he watched Marco's operation. The man sat at the center table in the cafeteria, a rotating court of inmates approaching him like subjects before a king. Money changed hands, commissary items, rolled cigarettes, small favors. 2 guards stood nearby, deliberately looking elsewhere. Daniel noticed the hierarchy. Marco had 4 primary enforcers who collected payments and handled discipline. Below them were runners and lookouts. Below them were the payers, maybe 30 or 40 inmates who'd bought into the protection racket. But there were also outliers, inmates who sat alone, avoided Marco's tables, kept to themselves. Some looked broken. Others looked angry. All looked trapped. The most important thing they failed to realize was that any creature in nature becomes increasingly savage the more it is cornered. In the prison library that afternoon, his favorite refuge, Daniel found what he was looking for. A middle-aged white man with scarred knuckles and tired eyes, reading a worn paperback in the corner. Daniel had noticed him before, always alone, always alert, never engaging with Marco's crew. "Mind if I sit?" Daniel asked. The man looked up, surprised. "Free country. Well, relatively speaking." His voice carried the rasp of a long-time smoker. Daniel sat, pulled a book from the shelf at random. "I'm Daniel." Tommy Volkov." He set his book down. "You're new. C block, right? 2 weeks in." "Yeah, I seen you around. Keeping your head down. Smart." Tommy studied him. "But Marco got to you already, didn't he?" Daniel didn't answer directly. "You don't pay him." "No, I don't." "Why not?" Tommy laughed, a bitter sound. "Because I got nothing he wants. No money on the outside, no commissary worth stealing, and I'm too old and mean for him to use as an example. Been here 11 years. I know how to make myself not worth the trouble." He leaned closer. "But you're fresh meat with money. Marco's going to squeeze you until there's nothing left." "What if I don't let him?" Tommy's eyebrows rose. Then you're either stupid or you got a plan. And you don't look stupid. Daniel chose his words carefully. I'm a businessman. I understand leverage. I'm wondering what Marco's leverage actually is. His leverage is violence, Tommy said flatly, and numbers, and guards who look the other way because he pays them too. But violence is expensive, Daniel countered quietly. It draws attention. It's inefficient. The guards tolerate his operation because it keeps things orderly. If that order breaks down, his whole system collapses. Tommy stared at him, something like interest flickering in those tired eyes. You're thinking about fighting back. I'm thinking about understanding the game board. Kid, I'm going to give you some free advice. I watched Marco build his little empire over 8 years. He's smart, he's patient, and he's absolutely ruthless. Last guy who tried to stand up to him? They found him in the shower with a shattered jaw and 3 broken ribs. Guards called it a slip on wet tile. Tommy shook his head. Marco doesn't just win, he makes examples. Daniel absorbed this. Who was the guy? The one who tried to fight back? Name was Peterson. Young guy, military background. Thought his training meant something in here. It didn't. Tommy paused. He paid after that. Everyone pays eventually. Where's Peterson now? Transferred to medical facility. Brain damage from the beating. Probably eating through a tube somewhere. Daniel felt cold rage settling in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. This was the system. This was the injustice he was facing. Not just Marco, an entire structure built on fear and exploitation. Thank you, Daniel said, for the honesty. Tommy picked up his book again. Don't do anything stupid. You seem like a decent guy. Just pay the man and survive. That evening, lying on his thin mattress in his 6x8 cell, Daniel stared at the concrete ceiling and let his mind work the way it always had, methodically, strategically, finding patterns others missed. In real estate, every property had value, and every value had leverage points. The key was identifying what the seller needed and what the buyer could exploit. This was no different. Marco's power rested on 3 foundations: fear, money, and tacit approval from the guards. Remove any one pillar, and the structure became unstable. Fear was the hardest to combat directly. Daniel had no muscle, no reputation for violence. But fear wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It was the belief in consequences. Money was interesting. Marco ran an economy, which meant he had revenue streams and expenses. He paid off guards, maintained his enforcers, and probably kicked up to someone higher in the prison hierarchy. Cash flow could be disrupted. The guards were the critical point. They enabled Marco because his system maintained order. But what if that order became disorder? What if Marco became a problem rather than a solution? Daniel pulled out the small notepad he'd purchased from commissary, supposedly for legal notes, and began writing. Not a plan yet, but observations, variables, possibilities, cell assignments, work details, guard rotations, commissary schedules, the timing of count, the layout of the yard, the hierarchy within Marco's organization. He wrote for an hour, his mind slipping into the focused state he used to enter when analyzing a complex property deal. Find the angle. Find the leverage. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Lights out in 5, Reid. Daniel looked up. Officer Daniels stood at the bars. A young guard, maybe late 20s, with the careful neutrality of someone trying not to make waves. Officer Daniels, Daniel acknowledged. The guard hesitated, then lowered his voice. Marco, talk to you today? Daniel set down his pen. He did. You should do what he says. Makes life easier for everyone. Everyone? Daniels' jaw tightened. Just advice, take it or leave it. He moved on to the next cell. Daniel watched him go, filing away another data point. Even the guards were afraid, or paid, or both. The lights went out. In the darkness, Daniel lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept turning over the problem, examining it from every angle. 24 hours. Marco wanted an answer in 24 hours. Daniel closed his eyes and began to smile, very slightly, in the darkness. He'd been framed for murdering his father by a woman who'd manipulated evidence so perfectly that a jury of 12 had convicted him. He'd lost his freedom, his reputation, his life. And now, in this concrete cage, a petty criminal wanted to extort him. The rage Daniel had kept tightly controlled since his arrest began to crystallize into something else, something colder, something more useful. He'd spent 2 weeks observing, learning, staying quiet, being underestimated. That was about to change, because Daniel Reid understood something fundamental that Marco Jackson had forgotten. In any closed system, the person who truly understands the architecture controls everything. And Daniel was very, very good at understanding architecture. Tomorrow, he'd start building. Not with concrete and steel, but with psychology and strategy. He'd find Marco's weaknesses, map his dependencies, identify the pressure points, and then, very carefully, very methodically, he'd dismantle the man's entire kingdom. Not with violence, not with confrontation. With the one thing Daniel had always been best at, seeing 10 moves ahead while everyone else was focused on the board right in front of them. In the darkness of cell C-247, Daniel Reid began to plan his revenge, and this time he wouldn't be the one trapped. Morning count came at 6 a.m. sharp. Daniel stood at his cell door as Officer Daniels moved down the line, clipboard in hand, mechanical in his routine. The young guard's eyes flicked to Daniel for just a moment. A question, maybe concern, before moving on. Daniel had slept 3 hours. The rest of the night, he'd refined his plan, examining it from every angle, stress-testing the logic. In real estate, you never made an offer until you'd walked the property twice, checked the comps 3 times, and understood every structural flaw. This was no different. At breakfast, Marco's table was predictably full. The man held court, like always, laughing at something one of his enforcers said, projecting ease and control. But Daniel noticed something he'd missed before. Marco's eyes constantly swept the cafeteria, cataloging, assessing. The man was paranoid. Good. Paranoia was a weakness. Daniel took his tray to an empty table near the windows, deliberately positioning himself in Marco's line of sight. He ate slowly, calmly, showing no anxiety. Let Marco wonder. Let him think Daniel was considering payment. Psychological warfare started with optics. You got a death wish or something? Daniel looked up. A young Hispanic inmate stood across from him, tray in hand, eyebrows raised. He couldn't have been more than 25, with gang tattoos creeping up his neck and wariness in his eyes. Just eating breakfast, Daniel said evenly. Yeah, well, you're about to become Marco's example. Everyone's talking about it. Rich boy who thinks he doesn't have to pay. The kid shook his head. I'd find somewhere else to sit if I were you. Being associated with you right now? That's bad for health. What's your name? Daniel asked. The kid hesitated. Why? Because you came over here to warn me. That was decent. Carlos. And I wasn't being decent. I was being smart. Your blood splatter might reach my table. But he sat down anyway, keeping his voice low. Look, man, I don't know what you're thinking, but Marco's got this place locked. You can't win. Nobody wins against him. Daniel studied Carlos. Young, scared, but with an edge of defiance buried under survival instinct. You pay him? Everyone pays him, except the guys who got nothing left to take, and even they pay in other ways. Protection, information, whatever Marco needs. Carlos glanced over his shoulder. He's watching us right now. I shouldn't even be talking to you. Then why are you? Carlos's jaw tightened. Because I used to be like you. Thought I was smart, thought I could handle myself. Then Marco's boys caught me in the shower, broke 2 ribs and my nose. Now I pay, and I keep my head down, and I survive. He leaned closer. That could be you tomorrow, Daniel. Is your pride really worth eating through a tube? Daniel set down his fork. What if I told you I wasn't planning to fight Marco? Then you're paying him. Smart choice. What if I told you there was a third option? Carlos stared at him, confusion flickering across his face. There is no third option. There's always a third option, Daniel said quietly. The question is whether people are brave enough to see it. Before Carlos could respond, one of Marco's enforcers, a thick-necked white guy with swastika tattoos, appeared at their table. Reid, boss wants to talk. Daniel stood slowly, maintaining his calm exterior. Carlos quickly grabbed his tray and left, not looking back. Smart kid. Daniel followed the enforcer across the cafeteria, feeling dozens of eyes tracking his movement. Marco sat at his throne, finishing his coffee. He gestured to the seat across from him. The enforcer positioned himself behind Daniel's chair. Morning, Daniel, Marco said, voice friendly but eyes cold. Sleep well? Well enough. Good, good. So, we had our conversation yesterday. 24 hours, I said. Marco checked his watch, an expensive piece that shouldn't have been in prison. You got about 18 hours left. I wanted to check in, see if you had any questions. You know, customer service. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Actually, I do have a question. Marco leaned back, amused. Go ahead. How much do you pay the guards? The temperature at the table dropped 10 degrees. The enforcer behind Daniel tensed. Marco's smile remained, but his eyes went flat. That's a strange question. Is it? Daniel kept his tone conversational. I'm a businessman, Marco. You're running a business. I respect that. But I like to understand the full picture before I commit to any deal. So I'm curious. What's your overhead? How much goes to the guards? How much to your enforcers? What's your actual profit margin on this operation? Marco studied him for a long moment. You think you're clever. I think I'm thorough. Let me make something clear, Daniel. Marco's voice went quiet, dangerous. You're not in a boardroom anymore. You're in my house. And in my house, you don't ask about my business. You pay your rent and shut your mouth. Or what? Daniel asked softly. You'll make an example of me? Like you did with Peterson? Marco's face went stone. You've been talking to people. I've been observing. That's what I do. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Here's what I've observed, Marco. You run a sophisticated operation. You've got 30, maybe 40 inmates paying you monthly. Plus, whatever side deals you're running, commissary markups, phone privileges, drug distribution, call it maybe 15, 20,000 a month gross revenue. Not bad for a prison economy. Marco said nothing, but Daniel could see the calculation happening behind those eyes. How much does this guy know? But your costs are high, Daniel continued. You're paying off at least 3 guards, probably more. Your enforcers need their cut. And you're probably kicking up to someone. Maybe a gang on the outside. Maybe someone higher in the prison administration. So, your actual profit. maybe 6,000 a month, which is good money, but it's fragile. It depends on everyone staying scared, everyone staying in line. You done with your analysis? Marco asked, his voice tight. Almost. Daniel held his gaze. See, what concerns me is sustainability. Your model depends on fear and compliance, but fear is expensive to maintain. You have to keep making examples, keep showing force, and that draws attention. Eventually, administration has to respond, not because they care about the inmates, but because visible violence threatens their own positions. So your operation has a shelf life, maybe a year, maybe two before it collapses, or you get transferred. Marco's hand moved to the table, fingers drumming once. You think you understand my business? I think I understand all businesses, and I think you're about to make a costly mistake. Really? Marco's voice was ice. Explain that to me. Daniel kept his expression neutral, but inside, his pulse was steady. This was the critical moment. You're about to beat me or kill me to make an example. That's your instinct when someone challenges you. But I'm not like the others, Marco. I'm connected. My father's estate is in litigation, which means lawyers, accountants, investigators. If I get seriously hurt or die in here, there will be questions, real questions, from people with resources. You think that matters to me? I think it should, because those questions will lead to investigations. Investigations will expose your guard payoffs. Your guards will panic, cut deals to save themselves. Your whole operation collapses in 30 days. Daniel paused. Is my 5,000 a month worth that risk? The table went silent. Marco stared at him, and Daniel could see the man recalculating, reassessing. You're bluffing, Marco finally said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Maybe, Daniel acknowledged. Or maybe I already sent letters to my lawyers telling them exactly who to look at if something happens to me. Maybe those letters mention specific guards by name. Maybe they mention you. He shrugged. You won't know until it's too late. Marco's jaw clenched. Behind Daniel, the enforcer shifted his weight, waiting for orders. Here's my counteroffer, Daniel said, his voice calm. I don't pay you, but I also don't cause you problems. I keep my head down, serve my time quietly. And when I leave, your operation continues untouched. Clean separation. No drama. That's not how this works, Marco said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. It is now. Daniel stood up slowly. You've got 18 hours to think about it. But consider this. Right now, I'm just another inmate. But if you make me an enemy, I become a problem that costs you everything. Is your pride worth that? He walked away before Marco could respond, feeling the weight of stares following him out of the cafeteria. His heart was pounding, adrenaline coursing through his system, but his face remained calm. It was a gamble, a calculated, strategic gamble. But that's all life was. Risk management and leverage. The afternoon passed in tense silence. Daniel went to his work detail in the laundry, folding sheets with mechanical precision, while his mind kept running scenarios. Marco would be conferring with his inner circle, weighing options, assessing risk. The key was plausibility. Daniel didn't actually have letters to lawyers. They'd been forbidden from contacting him pending appeal. But Marco didn't know that. And in prison, perception often mattered more than reality. At 3 p.m., Daniel was summoned to the counselor's office. Officer Daniels escorted him, unusually quiet. You're making waves, Daniels finally said, as they walked the corridor. Just having conversations. Marco's not someone you want to have conversations with. Daniels glanced around, lowered his voice. Look, I don't know what you said to him, But he's been asking questions, calling people on the outside. That's not normal. Should I be worried? You should be careful. They reached the counselor's office. Daniels opened the door. 5 minutes, administrative review. Inside, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes sat behind a cluttered desk. Her nameplate read, J. Morrison, Inmate Services. Mr. Reid, sit please. She gestured to the chair. This is just a routine check-in. How are you adjusting to the facility? Fine, thank you. She pulled up his file on her computer. You've been here 2 weeks. No incidents, no write-ups. That's good. She looked at him over her glasses. But I've heard some concerning things. Inmates talking about conflicts, tension on C block. Anything you want to report? Daniel recognized the trap immediately. If he complained about Marco, he'd be labeled a snitch. If he said nothing, he was complicit in his own victimization. Prison has its dynamics, he said carefully. I'm learning to navigate them. Are you feeling safe? As safe as anyone can be in here. Daniel's answers were so political that he managed to navigate the traps successfully without putting himself at risk. Morrison studied him, then closed the file. Mr. Reid, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I've seen a lot of inmates come through. Most fall into patterns. They either join a group for protection, keep their heads down, and survive, or they challenge the system and get hurt. She paused. You strike me as intelligent, so let me be direct. If you're planning something that will disrupt this facility, it's going to end badly for you. I'm not planning anything, Daniel said honestly. I'm just trying to serve my time. Good. Keep it that way. She opened a drawer, pulled out a form. Now, I need you to sign this confirming we had this conversation and that you reported no concerns. Daniel signed. Standard CYA procedure, covering their institutional ass if something happened later. Back in his cell that evening, Daniel lay on his bunk and waited. Marco would respond tonight. He had to. The man couldn't afford to look indecisive in front of his organization. The question was, which way would he jump? At 8:30, during the evening recreation period, Daniel got his answer. He was in the day room, playing chess against himself, when Tommy Volkov sat down across from him. You got balls, kid. I'll give you that, Tommy said, his voice low. Word is, you told Marco to go fuck himself. Not in those words. Close enough. Tommy moved a pawn on the board. You got the whole block talking. Half think you're crazy, half think you're dead. What do you think? Tommy considered the chess pieces. I think you might have actually done it. Marco's scared. I can see it. He's been making calls, asking questions, showing cracks. That's new. Scared doesn't mean beaten. No, but it means vulnerable. And in here, that's everything. Tommy looked up, his scarred face serious. But you need to understand, Marco can't let this go completely. Even if he leaves you alone, he has to do something. Saving face is survival for men like him. What do you think he'll do? Test you. Small things at first. Maybe steal your commissary, mess with your mail, see if you really have the connections you claim. And if you don't respond, if you hold your line, then maybe he lets it drop. Tommy leaned back. But that's best case. Worst case, he decides killing you is worth the risk. Daniel nodded slowly, considering this. If it comes to that, can I count on you to tell people what happened? Tommy stared at him. You want me to be your witness? I want someone to know the truth. That's all. For a long moment, Tommy said nothing. Then he extended his hand. You're either the smartest or stupidest guy I've met in here. Haven't decided which yet. But yeah, if something happens, I'll make sure people know. They shook hands. It wasn't much, Just one old con's promise to another inmate. But in this place, it was something. Daniel was about to speak when the day room door opened. Marco walked in, flanked by his two primary enforcers. The room went quiet. Inmates scattered to the walls, sensing something was about to happen. Marco walked straight to Daniel's table. His face was calm, controlled, but Daniel could see the tension in his shoulders. "Walk with me," Marco said. They went outside to the recreation yard, the enforcers trailing. It was dusk, the sky streaked with orange and purple. A few inmates shot hoops at the far end, but otherwise the yard was empty. Marco stopped by the fence, looking out at nothing. For a long moment, he said nothing. "You know what you did today?" Marco finally spoke, his voice quiet. "You backed me into a corner, in front of my people. Nobody does that." Daniel waited, saying nothing. "I could kill you right now," Marco continued. "Snap your neck, leave you here, call it a yard accident. I've done it before. Guards know not to ask questions." "But you won't," Daniel said calmly. "Why not?" "Because you don't know if I'm bluffing. And that uncertainty will haunt you. Every day, you'll wonder if letters are sitting in some law office waiting to destroy you. You'll second-guess every move, every decision." Daniel turned to face him. "That's worse than any beating you could give me. That's psychological prison." Marco's hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed. He laughed, a harsh sound. "You're something else, you know that? Most guys in here, they're all muscle, no brains. But you," he shook his head, "you're playing a different game." "I'm just trying to survive." "No, you're trying to win." Marco looked at him, something like respect flickering in his eyes. "All right, Daniel Reid, you get your free pass. You don't pay me, but that means you get no protection either. Someone comes at you, you're on your own. And trust me, there are people in here who will test you just to see what happens." "I understand." "Do you?" Marco stepped closer. "Because here's the thing. You beat me today with words and strategy. But this place? Eventually, it breaks everyone down to physical. Eventually, someone will test you with fists, or worse. And when that happens, your clever mind won't help you." "Maybe," Daniel acknowledged, "but I'll deal with that when it comes." Marco studied him for another moment, then turned to leave. He paused, looked back. "You remind me of someone. Guy I knew on the outside. Smart like you, always thinking 3 steps ahead. You know where he ended up?" "Where?" "Dead. Shot by someone dumber but faster." Marco smiled coldly. "Intelligence is overrated in here. Remember that." He walked away, his enforcers following. Daniel stood alone in the yard, watching the sun disappear below the horizon. His hands were shaking, delayed adrenaline, the body processing what the mind had kept controlled. But he'd done it. He'd faced down Marco Jackson and walked away intact. Not through violence, not through submission, through calculation, leverage, and the strategic deployment of doubt. It wasn't complete victory. Marco was right that physical challenges would come. But Daniel had bought himself time, space, and most importantly, he'd proven to himself and everyone watching that the system could be gamed. The injustice he'd faced, Marco's extortion, the corrupt guards, the violent enforcement of an artificial hierarchy, hadn't been eliminated. But it had been exposed as what it truly was, a house of cards built on fear. And Daniel Reid understood something fundamental about fear. It was only as powerful as people's belief in it. Back in his cell that night, as lights out was called and the block settled into darkness, Daniel allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His stepmother had put him in here, framed him for murder, taken everything from him. But she hadn't taken his mind, hadn't taken his ability to analyze, adapt, and overcome. In 14 days, he'd gone from terrified new inmate to someone who'd challenged the prison's power structure and survived. It was a small victory in a much larger war. His appeal was still pending, his freedom still stolen, justice still distant. But it was a start, and sometimes, in the darkest places, a start was everything. Daniel closed his eyes, his breathing steady. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be other Marcos, other systems of injustice, other battles to fight. But tonight, in this moment, he'd won. Not with his fists, not with violence, but with the one weapon they could never take away from him. The cold, calculating intelligence that saw through fear to the vulnerabilities beneath. The silent architect, building his escape one psychological brick at a time. In the darkness, Daniel smiled. The game had only just begun.